Uncle, could you take me to see my mom? What? Who are you to ask me to take you to see your mother? Edward Harrison looked up in surprise. The little girl standing in front of him tightened her grip on the bouquet she was holding. White daisies mixed with 2 red carnations, their stems wrapped in folded newspaper and tied carefully with a thin piece of blue yarn. I'm sorry, sir, she said softly. Her voice was polite, the careful tone of a child who had been taught to respect adults. He had come to this quiet stretch of the Riverwalk to be alone. Evening was settling over Chicago, and the river moved slowly between the glass towers reflecting the fading gold light of sunset. But now the quiet had been broken by a child asking him to take her to see her mother. "My name is Annie," she said after a moment. She hugged the bouquet tighter. "Annie Johnson." Edward nodded slightly. "And my mom's name is Sarah Johnson." The moment Edward heard the name, something inside him froze. Sarah Johnson. For a brief instant, the sounds of the river faded, replaced by a memory he hadn't thought about in years. 3 years ago, a storm rolling in from Lake Michigan, emergency weather alerts flashing across construction reports, emails sent late at night between project managers, workers missing. Edward's eyes drifted across the river. There, on the opposite bank, the tall cranes of Riverside Harbor rose against the darkening sky. Their metal arms stretched over stacks of cargo containers illuminated by harsh floodlights. Even now the harbor dominated the skyline. Edward Harrison knew every inch of that place, because he had built it. The Riverside Harbor Expansion Project, $2 billion of investment, shipping contracts, and political negotiations. The project that had turned Chicago's aging docks into one of the busiest cargo ports on the Great Lakes. But 3 years ago, before the harbor had fully opened, a violent storm had swept through the construction site overnight. Winds howling, waves crashing against unfinished docks. Most of the workers had made it out. Some had not, including one woman, Sarah Johnson. Edward blinked and returned his attention to the girl standing in front of him. She had no idea what had just passed through his mind. Annie lifted the flowers slightly. "These are for my mom," she said quietly. Edward glanced down at the bouquet. "And where exactly do you want to bring those?" he asked gently. Annie turned toward the river, her small arm extended, pointing across the dark water. Edward followed the direction of her finger, straight toward Riverside Harbor. "That's where she was," Annie said softly. Edward exhaled slowly. "Yes," he said. "I know." Annie seemed relieved that he understood. "They said the storm came really fast that night," she continued. "My grandma told me the wind knocked over some of the cranes." Edward remembered reading the damage report. Equipment failure, dock flooding, missing personnel, lines of cold language typed neatly into a file. But Annie spoke about it differently. "They searched for her for a long time," the girl said, "but they never found her." The wind moved quietly across the river below them. Edward lowered his gaze for a moment. "I'm sorry, Annie." The girl nodded slightly. "I know." But then she lifted her chin again. "My grandma says the water keeps things." Edward looked at her. "She says the river remembers everyone." Annie held up the flowers. "So I bring these every year." Edward frowned slightly. "Every year?" Annie nodded. "Grandma always takes me." Her voice softened. "We brought these flowers to visit Mother." Edward said nothing. "But this year Grandma got sick." Her fingers tightened around the bouquet. "She tried to come with me this morning." The girl swallowed. "But she couldn't walk very far." Edward studied her carefully now. "So you came here alone?" Annie nodded. "I saw you sitting on the bench." She hesitated, then added shyly, "You looked like someone who could drive." Edward almost laughed at that. Instead, he rubbed his chin slowly. "And you thought I would take you across the city to a construction harbor?" Annie looked down at the flowers again, then back up at him. Her eyes were hopeful but nervous. "Maybe," she said quietly. Edward didn't answer right away. Across the water, the cranes of Riverside Harbor stood like dark skeletons against the evening sky. 3 years ago, that storm had been just another complication in a project report, another problem to solve. But now the name Sarah Johnson had a face standing in front of him, a girl holding a trembling bouquet of flowers. "Please," Annie whispered. Edward Harrison had spent 20 years making decisions that moved millions of dollars. But this small request from a child somehow felt heavier than any contract he had ever signed. He stood slowly from the bench. His driver, who had been waiting beside the black sedan nearby, straightened immediately. Edward looked across the river once more, then back down at Annie. "Come on," he said quietly. "We're going to the harbor." For the first time since she had approached him, Annie smiled. Edward opened the rear door of the black sedan and stepped aside so Annie could climb in first. For a girl holding a bouquet wrapped in newspaper, the car looked like something from another world. Annie leaned forward and peeked inside. The leather seats were spotless. The air inside carried a faint scent of clean upholstery and something woody Edward's cologne lingering from earlier in the day. She glanced back at Edward nervously. "Are you sure it's okay?" she asked. Edward nodded once. "Yes." She carefully climbed inside, sitting at the very edge of the seat as if afraid to damage something. The bouquet never left her hands. Edward walked around the other side and slid into the seat beside her. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror. "Where to, Mr. Harrison?" Edward looked through the windshield toward the harbor lights across the river. "Riverside Harbor," he said. The driver paused only a fraction of a second before nodding. "Yes, sir." The car pulled smoothly away from the curb and joined the evening traffic flowing along the river. For a few moments neither Edward nor Annie spoke. Annie sat very still. Her feet didn't reach the floor. She kept the bouquet resting on her lap, carefully holding the stems with both hands. Edward watched her from the corner of his eye. Then suddenly he asked, "How old are you?" The question seemed to surprise Annie. She turned toward him. "6, she answered. Edward nodded slowly. 6 years old, which meant Annie had been only 3 when the storm took her mother. He looked forward again, silent. The car continued down the river road. After several blocks, Annie spoke again. "Edward?" "Yes. You don't have to call me sir, right?" He shook his head slightly. "No." She seemed relieved. "Okay, Edward." She tried saying his name carefully, like a word she wasn't used to. Then she looked out the window again. Chicago at night looked different from the back seat of a car. Annie pressed her nose lightly against the glass before sitting back again. "My grandma says rich people live up there," she said, pointing toward the tall towers in the distance. Edward followed her finger. "Yes," he said. "Sometimes." Annie looked down at the flowers again. "My grandma says rich people are very busy." Edward allowed himself a faint smile. "She's not wrong." The car drove another block in silence. Then Annie spoke again. "Do you think the harbor looks different now?" Edward frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "Since the storm." Edward turned his gaze forward. "I imagine it does." Annie nodded slowly. "My grandma said it used to look like a forest of metal," she said. Cranes everywhere. Edward could picture it easily. Before the storm, the cranes had indeed looked like a forest. Steel arms reaching across the docks, ships loading through the night. But now some of them are broken. Annie continued quietly. Edward's jaw tightened. "Yes." They drove for another minute before Annie spoke again. "My mom wasn't supposed to work that night." Edward turned toward her slightly. "What do you mean?" "She knew the storm was coming," Annie said. "My grandma told her she should stay home." The bouquet shifted in her hands as the car turned, but Mom said they had to finish loading the ships first. Edward felt something heavy settle inside his chest. "She said the company would lose a lot of money if they stopped," Annie continued. Edward looked out the window. Traffic lights changed ahead of them. Cars rolled through the intersection. The city kept moving. Inside the car, Annie's voice stayed calm. "She promised she'd come home before breakfast," the girl said. Edward didn't speak. "She told Grandma not to worry." Silence filled the car for a moment. Then Edward asked quietly, "How much do you remember about that night?" Annie thought for a moment. "Some." Her eyes returned to the harbor lights growing larger ahead. "I remember the rain. And the thunder." Edward closed his eyes briefly. 3 years earlier, he had been sitting in a glass office tower reading storm alerts on a tablet. Storm intensifying. Dock evacuation recommended. Then the reply that had followed. Schedule cannot slip. Continue operations. Edward had not typed those words, but the harbor had still been his project, his investment, his responsibility. The car slowed as they entered the industrial district near the docks. Warehouses replaced office buildings. Streetlights grew farther apart. The distant sound of machinery drifted through the night. Annie leaned forward slightly. "We're getting close." Edward could see the cranes now. Their shapes rose against the dark sky like enormous skeletons. The driver slowed. "Security gate ahead, sir." Edward nodded. "That's fine." Annie held the flowers tighter. "Edward?" "Yes." "Do you think she'll know I came?" Edward looked at her. For a moment, Edward Harrison, billionaire investor, builder of cities, did not know how to answer a 6-year-old girl. Finally, he said softly, "I think she would be very proud you came." If this story touched your heart, please like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. Annie nodded. The black sedan rolled slowly toward the tall security gates of Riverside Harbor. Floodlights lit the docks in bright white light. Rows of shipping containers stretched toward the dark water. The car stopped beside the checkpoint. A security guard stepped forward, then straightened immediately when he recognized the man in the back seat. "Mr. Harrison." Edward opened the door. "Yes." The guard glanced briefly at Annie before stepping aside. "Gates open, sir." Edward stepped out and looked down at the girl. "We're here." Annie climbed out carefully, still holding the bouquet. For a moment she simply stood there staring at the harbor. Then she whispered quietly, "Hi, Mom." Edward followed her gaze toward the dark water beyond the docks. 3 years ago, the storm had taken something from this place. Tonight it had brought something back. A little girl carrying flowers. Annie stood still at the edge of the harbor entrance, clutching the bouquet against her chest as if the flowers themselves were guiding her. The floodlights above the docks hummed faintly, casting long white beams across the stacked shipping containers and the dark water beyond them. Edward stepped out of the car behind her. For a moment, he simply watched the small figure standing there. 3 years ago, this place had been chaos. Tonight, it was silent. The wind coming off Lake Michigan carried the faint metallic scent of salt water and rust. Somewhere far out on the harbor, a buoy bell clanged softly against the waves. Annie took a small step forward. The gravel beneath her sneakers crunched loudly in the stillness. Edward nodded to the driver. "Wait here." "Yes, sir." Edward walked toward Annie slowly. The harbor was enormous up close. Towering cranes loomed above them like giant skeletons frozen in place. Rows of cargo containers stretched across the dockyard in long, silent corridors. Annie looked around carefully. "Grandma and I usually stand over there," she said quietly. She pointed toward the end of a concrete pier where the lights reflected across the water. Edward followed her. His footsteps were slower now. Every corner of the harbor carried memories he had spent 3 years avoiding. The unfinished steel beams near the eastern dock, the collapsed crane that had never been fully repaired, the section of railing along the pier where the waves had surged over the edge that night. Annie reached the end of the pier and stopped. The water below them moved slowly, dark and endless. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she carefully knelt down. Edward remained standing a few feet behind her. The girl placed the bouquet gently on the concrete beside the railing. "Hi, Mom," she whispered. The wind lifted the petals of the daisies slightly. Edward felt something shift in his chest. Annie stayed kneeling there for several seconds. Then she began speaking again, quietly, as if the water itself were listening. "Grandma couldn't come today," she said. "She said to tell you she loves you." Edward turned his gaze toward the horizon. A cargo ship far out in the harbor moved slowly beneath the lights of the distant docks. Annie continued, "She's getting better, though." Her voice carried the calm certainty children often use when they want something to be true. "She said she'll come next year." Edward heard his own voice inside his head. 3 years ago. Storm surge warnings. Evacuation recommended. Continue operations. Schedule cannot slip. He exhaled slowly. Behind him, the security guard at the gate pretended not to watch. Everyone in Chicago's harbor district knew who Edward Harrison was. But tonight he wasn't here as a billionaire. He was standing beside a 6-year-old girl speaking to the water. Annie stood up again and brushed dust from her jacket. She looked out across the harbor. "Grandma says the river connects to the lake," she said. Edward nodded. "It does. And the lake connects to the ocean?" "Yes." Annie considered that. "So Mom could be anywhere now." Edward did not answer immediately. Finally, he said quietly, "Maybe." The girl looked satisfied with that answer. She turned back toward the flowers resting beside the railing. Then she looked up at Edward again. "Edward?" "Yes? Did you know my mom?" The question landed harder than anything she had said all evening. Edward's throat tightened slightly. He could still see the name on the report. Sarah Johnson. Dock worker. Missing. Presumed dead. But Annie wasn't asking about a report. She was asking about a person. Edward took a slow breath. "I didn't know her personally," he said carefully, "but I know she worked very hard here." Annie nodded. "Grandma says she was the strongest person she ever met." Edward believed that without question. Anyone working these docks had to be strong. The wind shifted slightly across the harbor. The bouquet rustled softly beside the railing. Annie walked closer to the edge of the pier. Edward instinctively stepped closer as well. The water below was black and restless. Grandma says storms are like angry oceans, Annie said. Edward folded his arms quietly. That's one way to describe them. Annie leaned on the railing. Do storms come back to the same places? Edward thought about that. Sometimes. The girl stared out over the water. I wish that storm hadn't come here. Edward didn't respond. Some truths didn't have answers. After a while, Annie turned back toward him. Thank you for bringing me. Edward looked down at her. You're welcome. She smiled gently. You're nicer than most rich people. Edward raised an eyebrow. Oh, Annie nodded seriously. Grandma says rich people forget about regular people. Edward looked back at the harbor cranes rising above them. He thought about investors, deadlines, emails, decisions made from office towers miles away from places like this. Then he looked at the bouquet beside the railing. Maybe Annie's grandmother wasn't entirely wrong. A sudden voice echoed from behind them. Mr. Harrison? Edward turned. The security guard was walking toward them now, but he wasn't alone. Another man followed behind him. A tall, older dock worker wearing a heavy jacket and a worn baseball cap. The man stopped when he reached the pier. He stared at Annie. Then his eyes widened slightly. Well, I'll be... he murmured. Annie looked up at him curiously. The old dock worker removed his cap slowly. You're Sarah's girl, aren't you? Annie nodded. Yes. The man's expression softened. I remember your mama, he said quietly. Edward felt the air grow heavier. The dock worker glanced at Edward briefly before looking back at Annie. She was one of the bravest workers we had here. Annie smiled. Grandma says that too. The old man nodded. Then he looked toward the water. That storm took a lot from this harbor. Edward knew that already. But hearing it spoken out loud felt different. The dock worker turned back to Annie. You coming back next year? Annie nodded confidently. Yes. Edward looked at the flowers resting by the railing again. For the first time in 3 years, Riverside Harbor felt less like a project and more like a memory. A place where something unfinished was waiting to be understood. Annie picked up the empty newspaper wrapper that had fallen from the bouquet and tucked it neatly into her backpack. Then she looked up at Edward again. Can we come back next year too? Edward didn't hesitate. Yes. Annie smiled again. Behind them, the harbor lights flickered across the water like quiet stars. And for the first time since the storm 3 years ago, Edward Harrison felt something inside him begin to change. Edward remained standing beside the pier long after Annie finished speaking with the old dock worker. The harbor had grown quieter. Far out across the water, a cargo vessel moved slowly beneath the dim glow of navigation lights, its engines humming like a distant thunder that never quite reached the shore. The dock worker leaned against the railing and studied Annie again. You got your mama's eyes, he said gently. Annie smiled a little at that. Grandma says that too. The man nodded thoughtfully. Well, she was a good woman. Edward watched the exchange silently. The old worker finally turned toward him. Mr. Harrison. Edward gave a small nod. Evening. The man adjusted his cap. Didn't expect to see you down here this late. Edward glanced across the dark stretch of water. Neither did I. The dock worker followed his gaze. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Annie tugged lightly on Edward's sleeve. Edward? Yes. She pointed toward a section of the harbor farther down the pier. Grandma says the storm came from that direction. Edward looked where she was pointing. Out beyond the breakwater, the lake disappeared into darkness. 3 years ago, the wind had come screaming across that same water. He remembered the storm warnings that night. Meteorologists had predicted dangerous conditions. Wind speeds rising, water surging against the docks. The evacuation recommendation had come just before midnight. Edward remembered reading the report the next morning. The words had seemed distant then. Technical, clinical. Now they felt personal. The dock worker cleared his throat. That storm was the worst I ever saw on this lake, he said. Annie listened carefully. You were here? The man nodded. Most of us were. His eyes drifted toward the broken crane standing crooked near the far dock. Wind came in like a freight train. Edward felt the weight of the moment settling around him. The worker continued. Water was crashing over the loading decks. He paused. Some folks made it out just in time. Annie's small voice broke the silence. And my mom? The dock worker looked down at her. For a moment, he didn't answer. Edward could see the conflict in the man's eyes. Finally, he spoke gently. Your mama stayed behind, helping some others get off the dock. Annie nodded slowly. That answer seemed to fit the picture she already carried in her mind. Grandma says Mom always helped people. That she did, the man said. The wind shifted across the harbor again. Edward stared out across the water. 3 years ago, he had never heard that part of the story. All the reports had mentioned were numbers, missing workers, structural damage, financial delays, but not courage, not sacrifice. The dock worker straightened slightly. "Well," he said quietly, "I should get back to the gate." He looked down at Annie again. "You take care of yourself, kid." "I will," Annie said. The man gave Edward a final nod before walking back across the pier toward the security post. Silence returned to the harbor. Annie looked down at the flowers resting beside the railing. Then she spoke softly. "Edward?" "Yes." "Do you think my mom was scared?" The question landed gently but heavily. Edward took a long breath before answering. "Storms are scary," he admitted, "but your mom sounds like a very brave person." Annie considered that. "Grandma says brave people feel scared too." Edward nodded. "She's right." The girl looked out across the water again. "But they help anyway." Edward felt a tightness in his chest. "Yes," he said quietly, "they do." For several moments, they simply stood there together. The harbor lights reflected across the moving water like scattered gold. Then Annie reached down and carefully adjusted the flowers so the bouquet leaned neatly against the railing. "There," she said. Edward raised an eyebrow slightly. "Making sure they don't fall?" Annie nodded. "I want Mom to see them." Edward looked at the bouquet. The stems were uneven, the flowers slightly bent from the wind, but there was something deeply sincere about them. No expensive arrangement from a florist could have carried more meaning. Annie dusted her hands against her jacket and turned back toward Edward. "Can we stay just a little longer?" Edward glanced at his watch. He had missed 3 phone calls already, 2 from his assistant, 1 from a board member. The harbor lights flickered across the glass face of his watch. For years, those calls would have taken priority over everything else, but tonight felt different. "Yes," he said, "we can stay." Annie smiled again. She leaned lightly against the railing, watching the water. "Grandma says the lake talks at night." Edward folded his arms. "What does it say?" Annie shrugged. "She says it tells stories about people who worked here." Edward looked across the docks again. Hundreds of workers had built this harbor. Men and women who loaded cargo through freezing winters and blistering summers. Most of them would never appear in a newspaper headline, but the harbor would never exist without them. Annie spoke again after a moment. "Edward?" "Yes?" "Did you build this place?" The question surprised him. He hesitated. "Yes." Annie looked around slowly. "It's very big." Edward gave a small nod. "It took a lot of people to build it." Annie seemed satisfied with that answer. Then she looked back at the water. "My mom helped build it too." Edward felt the words settle heavily inside him. "Yes," he said quietly. "She did." The wind rose again across the harbor. Annie shivered slightly inside her oversized jacket. Edward noticed immediately. "Are you cold?" "A little." He removed his coat and placed it gently around her shoulders. The coat hung almost to her knees. Annie giggled softly. "It's huge." Edward smiled faintly. "You'll grow into it." She wrapped the coat tighter around herself. For a while, they simply stood there together, watching the dark water move beneath the pier. Finally, Annie spoke again. "Edward?" "Yes." "Next year when I come back, will the harbor still be here?" Edward followed her gaze across the cranes and cargo stacks stretching toward the lake. "Yes," he said. "It will." Annie nodded slowly. "Good." She looked down once more at the flowers resting beside the railing. Then she whispered quietly toward the water. "Good night, Mom." The wind carried her words across the dark surface of the harbor. Edward Harrison stood beside her in silence, and somewhere deep inside him, a question that had been buried for 3 years was beginning to rise. Not about storms, not about construction reports, but about responsibility. The wind grew stronger as the night settled over Riverside Harbor. Annie stood quietly beside the railing, wrapped inside Edward's oversized coat. The sleeves covered most of her hands, but she didn't seem to mind. She looked smaller now, like a child who had finally finished something important. Edward watched the water for a long moment. 3 years. For 3 years, he had avoided this place after the investigation closed and the harbor reopened. Business had moved forward. Contracts had expanded. Investors had celebrated the project's success. But standing here tonight, the harbor looked different. Not like a success, like a memory. Annie shifted slightly beside him. "Edward?" "Yes?" "Can we walk a little more?" Edward glanced down the long concrete pier stretching deeper into the harbor. Floodlights illuminated rows of cargo containers stacked like silent buildings. "Sure," he said. They began walking slowly along the dock. The sound of their footsteps echoed across the empty concrete. Annie stayed close to the railing, occasionally glancing down into the dark water as if expecting something to rise from it. After a few steps, she asked another question. "Edward, were you here when the storm happened?" The question caught him off guard. He took a moment before answering. "No." "Where were you?" "New York." Annie nodded thoughtfully. "My grandma says storms move fast." "They do." She looked back toward the section of dock where they had left the flowers. "Grandma told me the workers tried to leave when the storm got worse." Edward's chest tightened slightly. He had read that line once, buried deep in a safety review that few people ever bothered to revisit. "Yes," he said quietly. "That's what the report said." Annie walked a few more steps in silence. Then she asked something else. "Why didn't they stop working?" Edward didn't answer immediately. The wind carried the distant sound of waves striking the outer breakwater. Finally, he said carefully, "Sometimes people feel pressure to finish things." Annie frowned slightly. "Even when it's dangerous?" Edward looked out across the harbor, cranes rising against the night sky. "Yes." "Why?" He didn't know how to explain the machinery of business to a 6-year-old child. Deadlines, contracts, investors waiting for ships that had to leave on schedule. So he answered simply, "Because someone above them wants the job done." Annie thought about that. Then she said quietly, "That doesn't sound very fair." Edward had no argument for that. "No," he admitted, "it doesn't." They reached a section of the dock where a damaged crane still stood frozen in place, its long metal arm tilted awkwardly toward the water, never fully repaired after the storm. Annie stopped walking. "Was that there when my mom worked here?" Edward nodded. "Yes." She studied the crane carefully. Grandma said one of the cranes almost fell into the water that night. Edward remembered that report too. Structural failure under extreme wind pressure. The crane had collapsed minutes after several workers evacuated the loading deck. Annie stepped closer to the railing beneath it. "This place must have been really loud during the storm," she said. Edward imagined the scene. Wind screaming through steel beams, metal cables snapping, waves slamming against the docks. "Yes," he said, "very loud." Annie turned back toward him. "Edward?" "Yes?" "Did the people who built this place know my mom?" Edward nodded. "I'm sure many of them did." Annie seemed pleased by that. She liked making friends. Edward smiled faintly. "That sounds like a good quality." They stood quietly beneath the broken crane for a while. Then Edward heard footsteps approaching behind them. He turned. The older dock worker from earlier was walking back toward the pier. This time he carried a flashlight and a thermos in one hand. "Thought you two might still be here," the man said. Annie waved. "Hi again." The worker smiled. "Evening, kid." He nodded toward Edward. "Mr. Harrison." Edward acknowledged him. "Everything all right?" The man shrugged. "Just making my rounds." He looked toward the dark water where Annie had placed the flowers. "Those still there?" Annie nodded proudly. "Yes." The worker leaned against the railing beside them. "You know," he said slowly, "your mama used to stand right around here during breaks." Annie's eyes widened. "Really?" "Sure did." He pointed toward a rusted section of railing. She'd lean right there and watch the ships come in. Annie walked over to the spot and touched the metal carefully. Edward watched the moment unfold. The worker took a sip from his thermos. "She talked about you a lot," he said. Annie turned around quickly. "She did?" "Every chance she got." The girl smiled. Edward saw something in the dock worker's expression then. A look that suggested the man remembered far more about that night than the official reports ever described. The worker glanced briefly at Edward, then back at Annie. "Your mama stayed longer than she should have that night," he said quietly. Edward felt the air grow heavier again. The worker continued slowly. "Some of the younger guys were scared of the storm." Annie listened carefully. She helped them get off the dock. The girl nodded, as if this only confirmed what she already believed about her mother. Edward remained silent, but inside him something had begun to shift again. The storm had not just taken lives, it had revealed character. And the more he listened tonight, the more he realized how little he had truly known about the people who built his harbor. The dock worker finished his drink and straightened. "Well," he said, "night's getting colder." Annie hugged Edward's coat around herself. The man smiled at her. "You heading home soon?" Annie looked up at Edward. Edward nodded. "Yes." The worker tipped his cap. "Good night, kid." "Good night." As the man walked away again, Annie looked back toward the water one last time. "Edward." "Yes." "Do you think Mom liked working here?" Edward looked across the harbor, the cranes, the docks, the endless water stretching beyond them. I think, he said quietly. She believed the work mattered. Annie seemed satisfied with that answer. She slipped her small hand into Edward's. Let's go tell Grandma we came. Edward looked down at her hand in his. And for the first time in years, Riverside Harbor no longer felt like a finished project. It felt like a story he had only just begun to understand. The walk back toward the car felt quieter than before. Annie held Edward's hand as they moved slowly along the dock. The wind off the lake had grown colder, slipping through the metal structures and empty cargo lanes with a low whistling sound. Behind them, the bouquet of flowers still rested against the railing. Edward glanced back once. For 3 years, that stretch of concrete had been nothing more than a line on a construction blueprint. Tonight it had become something else, a place where a child came to speak to her mother. They reached the edge of the pier where the floodlights brightened the ground beneath their feet. The black sedan waited near the security gate. Annie looked smaller now inside Edward's coat, but she walked with a quiet sense of completion, like someone who had finished an important errand. After a few moments, she spoke again. Edward? Yes. Do you think Mom heard me? Edward looked down at her. Children ask questions adults spend years learning to avoid. I think she did, he said gently. Annie nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. They continued walking. The driver stepped out of the car when he saw them approaching and opened the rear door. But Annie stopped before getting in. She turned around and looked back at the harbor one more time. The cranes towered in the distance like silent giants guarding the water. Grandma says the lake remembers people, Annie said quietly. Edward followed her gaze. Yes. Do you think places remember people too? Edward thought about that. About the dock worker who remembered Sarah Johnson. About the broken crane that still leaned over the harbor. About the reports he had read that never mentioned courage or sacrifice. Yes, he said finally. I think they do. Annie seemed satisfied with that. She climbed carefully into the back seat again, still wrapped in Edward's coat. Edward followed and closed the door. The driver glanced back. Heading home, sir? Edward hesitated. Then he looked at Annie. Where do you live? On Maple Street, she said. With my grandma. Edward nodded. Maple Street. The car pulled away from the harbor gates and rolled slowly back toward the city. For several minutes, Annie remained quiet, staring out the window as the cranes slowly disappeared behind them. Then she asked softly, Edward? Yes. Do you build a lot of places like that harbor? Yes. Why? The question made him pause. Edward had answered that question hundreds of times before. Economic growth, infrastructure development, trade expansion, all the phrases investors like to hear. But none of those answers seemed right for a 6-year-old girl. So people can work, he said simply. Annie nodded. My mom liked working. Edward believed that. The dock worker's words echoed again in his mind. Your mama stayed longer than she should have that night. He looked out the window as the city lights began appearing again. Traffic increased as they returned to the downtown streets. After a few blocks, Annie shifted slightly in her seat. Edward? Yes? Did you know about the storm before it came? The question landed unexpectedly. Edward felt his fingers tighten slightly against his knee. Yes, he said quietly. They warned people. Then why didn't everyone leave? Edward stared at the passing streetlights. That was the question, the one that had never truly been answered. Because the truth wasn't written clearly in the reports. The truth lived somewhere between deadlines, pressure, and decisions made far from the docks. I think, Edward said slowly, some people believed they still had time. Annie considered that. Sometimes grown-ups think that, she said. Edward looked at her. What do you mean? She shrugged. My grandma says people always think bad things won't happen to them. Edward gave a quiet breath of agreement. That's true. The car continued through the city. Soon, the tall glass buildings gave way to smaller neighborhoods. Streetlights became warmer. Restaurants glowed along the sidewalks where people sat finishing late dinners. Annie leaned her head lightly against the window. Edward? Yes. Grandma will be happy I went. I'm sure she will. She was worried I couldn't come this year. Edward glanced at the bouquet missing from Annie's hands. You made sure your mom still got her flowers. Annie smiled faintly. Yes. They drove another few minutes before Annie asked something else. Edward? Yes. Are you going to come next year too? The question surprised him. He had not thought that far ahead, but the answer came easily. Yes. Annie seemed relieved. Good. She leaned back into the seat, pulling the coat tighter around herself. Outside the car window, neighborhoods passed quietly under the streetlights. Finally, the driver slowed. "Maple Street ahead, sir." Edward looked out the windshield. The houses here were small but tidy. Front porches with worn wooden steps, porch lights glowing softly in the cool night air. "Stop here," Annie said, pointing toward a small white house with a dim light in the window. The car pulled to the curb. Edward stepped out first and helped Annie down from the seat. She slipped out of the coat carefully and handed it back to him. "Thank you." Edward took the coat but didn't put it on yet. A thin, elderly woman stood on the porch now, wrapped in a blanket, watching them with worried eyes. "Annie?" she called. The girl brightened instantly. "Grandma!" She ran up the short walkway and into the woman's arms. Edward watched quietly from the sidewalk. The grandmother held Annie tightly. "You scared me, child," she whispered. "I'm sorry," Annie said. "But I went to see Mom." The elderly woman looked toward Edward then. Their eyes met across the yard. Edward gave a small, respectful nod. The woman studied him carefully before nodding back. Annie turned and waved. "Good night, Edward." He raised a hand in return. "Good night, Annie." She disappeared inside the house with her grandmother. The porch light clicked off a moment later. Edward stood there for another few seconds before walking back to the car. As he sat down, the harbor returned to his mind again. The broken crane. The dock worker's words. Sarah Johnson standing on the dock during the storm. Edward looked out the window as the driver pulled away. For 3 years he had believed that story was finished. Tonight he realized something else. It had never truly been told. Edward did not go straight home that night. The black sedan moved quietly through the sleeping streets of Chicago, but his mind remained far away from the city lights. Images from the harbor replayed again and again in his thoughts. The flowers leaning against the railing, Annie's small voice whispering, "Hi, Mom," the dock worker saying, "Your mama stayed longer than she should have that night." Edward sat in silence in the back seat while the driver navigated through late-night traffic. Finally, the driver spoke. "Office, sir?" Edward looked up slowly. For years, the answer to that question had always been the same. Yes, because work never stopped. But tonight he shook his head slightly. "No." The driver glanced in the mirror. "Home?" Edward hesitated. Then he said quietly, "Take me back to the office." The driver nodded and turned the car toward downtown. The headquarters of Harrison Development stood 32 stories tall near the river, its glass facade reflecting the city skyline even in the darkness. Most of the lights were already off when the car pulled into the underground garage. Edward stepped out and rode the elevator alone. The building was silent at this hour. When the doors opened to the executive floor, the soft hum of climate control systems was the only sound. Edward walked into his office and turned on the desk lamp. The room filled with a warm amber glow. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Chicago River far below. From here, the city looked calm and orderly. Clean lines of light stretching through the streets like a carefully designed blueprint. But Edward no longer saw it the same way. He removed his coat slowly and draped it over the chair. Then he sat down at his desk. For several minutes, he did nothing. The harbor returned to his thoughts. 3 years. 3 years since the storm. He reached for his computer and pressed a key. The screen came to life. Edward opened the company archive system and typed 2 words into the search bar. Riverside Harbor. Dozens of files appeared instantly. Engineering reports, construction updates, financial summaries, insurance claims. He scrolled past them until he found the folder labeled Storm Incident Review. Edward opened it. The document was exactly as he remembered. Cold, precise, efficient. Date, October 14. Weather event, severe storm system, structural damage, crane collapse, dock flooding, personnel impact, 3 missing workers. Edward stared at the line for several seconds. 3 missing workers. One of those names was Sarah Johnson. He scrolled further. Recovery efforts conducted for 72 hours. 2 bodies recovered. 1 individual presumed deceased. Edward leaned back in his chair. Presumed deceased. That was how the report described Annie's mother. No mention of bravery. No mention of helping others escape. Just a line of text inside a document. Edward closed his eyes for a moment. He could still hear the dock worker's voice. "Your mama stayed longer than she should have that night." Edward reopened the file and scrolled again. Toward the bottom of the document, another section appeared. Operational timeline prior to storm escalation. There it was. A message from the site management team. Storm conditions increasing. Recommending temporary halt of loading operations. Below it, another message. Operations must continue to maintain shipping schedule. Edward read the line twice. He remembered seeing it before, but 3 years ago it had not meant anything to him. Now it did, because tonight he had met the daughter of the woman who never left that dock. Edward pushed his chair back slowly. He stood and walked toward the windows overlooking the river. The same river Annie had been standing beside earlier that evening. From this height, the water looked calm, peaceful, but Edward knew how quickly it could change. Storms did not announce themselves politely. They arrived with force. Behind him, the computer screen continued glowing softly on his desk. Edward returned to the chair and opened another file. This one contained the internal email thread from that night. The messages were short, direct. Storm warnings increasing. Dock supervisors requesting pause. Then the response. Schedule cannot slip. Continue operations. Edward stared at the line. He had not written those words, but the project had belonged to him, which meant the responsibility had also been his. He closed the laptop slowly. For years, he had believed the investigation had settled everything. Insurance companies had paid compensation. The project had continued. The harbor had opened. Business had moved forward. But tonight, something had changed, because now the story had a face. A 6-year-old girl holding a bouquet of flowers. Edward leaned back and exhaled slowly. Then he reached for the phone on his desk. He dialed a number from memory. After a few rings, a sleepy voice answered. "Hello? Martin," Edward said. The voice immediately woke. "Edward? Do you know what time it is?" "Yes. Is something wrong?" Edward looked at the storm report still open on his screen. "Yes." Martin Seahill, on the other end. Edward's oldest friend had been the company's chief legal officer for nearly 15 years. "What happened?" Edward spoke calmly. "I want to reopen the Riverside Harbor investigation." There was silence on the line. Then Martin laughed softly in disbelief. "You can't be serious." "I am." "Edward, that case was closed 3 years ago." "I know." "Insurance settled. Regulatory review completed. Everyone signed off." Edward looked again at the line on the report. 3 missing workers, 1 presumed deceased. "Not everyone," Edward said quietly. Martin paused. "What does that mean?" Edward thought about Annie standing beside the harbor railing. "Hi, Mom." "It means," Edward said slowly, "I think we stopped asking questions too soon." The silence on the phone grew longer this time. Finally, Martin said, "We'll talk about this tomorrow." Edward nodded. "Yes." He ended the call. Outside the windows, the river continued flowing through the sleeping city. But Edward Harrison knew something had begun tonight that could not easily be stopped. A 6-year-old girl had come to the harbor with flowers, and without realizing it, she had reopened a storm that never truly ended. Edward barely slept that night. The office lights stayed on until nearly 3 in the morning while the storm report remained open on his desk. He read it again and again, as if somewhere between the lines he might find something the investigation had missed. But every page told the same cold story. Weather conditions escalated rapidly. Operations continued until evacuation began. 3 workers unaccounted for. One name stayed fixed in his mind. Sarah Johnson. At some point, Edward leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. For years, he had believed the harbor project was one of the greatest successes of his career. Now it felt like something unfinished, something buried beneath paperwork. The first gray light of morning slipped through the tall windows before he realized he had not left the office. Chicago slowly came to life below him. Traffic filled the streets. Commuter trains rumbled across the bridges. The river moved steadily between the buildings as if nothing unusual had happened. Edward stood and stretched slightly. Then he walked toward the coffee machine near the wall. The office door opened just as he poured the first cup. Martin stepped inside. Edward's chief legal officer looked like a man who had dressed in a hurry. His tie hung slightly crooked, and he carried a leather briefcase under one arm. "You weren't kidding," Martin said. Edward handed him a cup of coffee. "No." Martin set the briefcase on the table and opened it. "You called me at midnight talking about reopening a storm investigation that's been closed for 3 years, he said. "So I figured I should come see what kind of crisis you've decided to create." Edward didn't smile. Instead, he slid the printed storm report across the table. Martin glanced at it briefly. "I've read that report 100 times. Read it again." Martin sighed but flipped through the pages anyway. After a minute, he looked up. "I still don't see what you're looking for." Edward leaned against the desk. "You ever meet Sarah Johnson?" Martin frowned. "No. She was one of the dock workers who didn't make it out that night." Martin nodded. "Yes." I remember the name. Edward spoke quietly. I met her daughter last night. Martin blinked. You what? A 6-year-old girl named Annie. Martin slowly lowered the report. And how exactly did you end up meeting the daughter of a worker who died 3 years ago? Edward walked toward the window. She was standing by the river holding flowers. Martin stared at him. For her mother? Yes. Silence filled the office for a moment. Finally, Martin said, And this makes you want to reopen an investigation that already cleared the company? Edward turned back toward him. It didn't clear anything. Martin raised an eyebrow. It cleared us legally. Edward didn't respond immediately. Martin continued carefully. Edward, storms happen. Accidents happen. The harbor project followed the regulations. That's what the investigators concluded. Edward tapped the report with one finger. Did they talk to the workers? Some of them. All of them? Martin hesitated. No. Edward nodded slowly. Last night, one of the dock workers told me something. Martin leaned back slightly. What? That Sarah Johnson stayed behind helping other workers get off the dock. Martin folded his arms. That's admirable. But it doesn't change the legal outcome. Edward's voice grew quieter. It changes the story. Martin watched him for a long moment. Edward, where is this really coming from? Edward thought about Annie standing beside the railing. Hi, Mom. He spoke slowly. 3 years ago I looked at numbers. And now? Now I'm looking at people. Martin rubbed his forehead. You realize reopening this could create serious problems. I know. Regulators could start asking questions again. I know. Investors will panic. Edward nodded. I know. Martin leaned forward across the table. So why are you doing this? Edward walked back toward the desk and picked up the storm report. He turned it so Martin could see the line again. One individual, presumed deceased. She wasn't a line in a report, Edward said quietly. Martin C. Hill. You're talking about guilt. Edward shook his head. No. Then what? Responsibility. The office fell silent again. Finally, Martin leaned back in his chair. All right, he said. Edward looked up. Martin tapped the report. If we reopen this, we do it carefully. Edward nodded. Of course. Martin closed the folder and slipped it back into his briefcase. The first step is finding the workers who were there that night. Edward thought of the old dock worker from the harbor. I know where to start. Martin stood up. And Edward? Yes. You realize once we start this, we might not like what we find. Edward looked out the window toward the river. 3 years ago, a storm had passed through the harbor. But storms did something else too. They revealed what had been hidden beneath the surface. That's exactly why we're doing it, Edward said. Martin gave a slow nod. Then he walked toward the door. As it closed behind him, Edward returned to the window overlooking the city. Somewhere across Chicago, a small girl named Annie was waking up in a quiet house on Maple Street. She had left flowers for her mother beside the harbor, and without knowing it, she had started something that might finally uncover the truth about the night the storm came. Edward spent the rest of the morning making calls. By 10 o'clock, the quiet determination that had begun the night before had turned into something more organized. Action. The office door opened again and Martin stepped back inside, this time carrying a thin folder. I made a few calls, Martin said. Edward looked up from his desk. And? Martin dropped the folder in front of him. These are the names of the workers who were on the dock the night of the storm. Edward opened it. A list of 12 names stared back at him. Supervisors, equipment operators, cargo handlers, and near the bottom of the page, Sarah Johnson. Edward studied the list carefully. Most of them still work around the harbor district, Martin continued. A few moved away, one retired. Edward tapped the first name on the list. Let's start here. Martin leaned forward slightly. Dock worker named Carlos Ramirez. He was on the loading deck when the storm hit. Edward stood. Then we should talk to him. Martin raised an eyebrow. You're going down there personally? Yes. Martin gave a small shrug. Well, if you're going to reopen the past, you might as well start where it happened. An hour later, the black sedan rolled once again toward Riverside Harbor, but the place looked different during daylight. Morning sun reflected off the steel cranes and cargo containers. Workers moved between the loading docks wearing reflective vests and hard hats. Forklifts beeped as they carried pallets across the concrete. The harbor was alive again. Edward stepped out of the car and looked across the massive operation. 3 years ago, he had stood here during the ribbon-cutting ceremony when the harbor officially opened. Politicians, press cameras, investors shaking hands, everyone celebrating progress. Now he was back for a different reason. Martin joined him on the dock. "You see that warehouse?" he said, pointing toward a low metal building near the shipping yard. Edward nodded. "That's where Ramirez works now." They walked across the yard together. Workers glanced up as they passed. Most recognized Edward Harrison immediately. A few whispered quietly to each other. The harbor owner rarely walked through the loading yards himself. Inside the warehouse, the smell of engine oil and sea air mixed together. A forklift rolled past them carrying stacked crates. Martin spotted a man near the loading ramp. "Carlos Ramirez?" The man turned. He was in his early 50s, with weathered hands and tired eyes. Years of dock work had carved deep lines into his face. "Yes." Martin gestured toward Edward. "This is Mr. Harrison." Ramirez wiped his hands on a cloth. "I know who he is." Edward stepped forward. "Mr. Ramirez, I'd like to ask you about the storm 3 years ago." The man froze slightly. The harbor was loud with machinery, but suddenly the moment felt quiet. Ramirez looked from Edward to Martin and back again. "That investigation already happened," he said cautiously. Edward nodded. "I know. Then why ask now?" Edward chose his words carefully. "Because I think we missed part of the story." Ramirez studied him for a long moment. Finally, he gestured toward a bench near the wall. "All right." They sat. For several seconds, the only sound was the distant hum of forklifts outside. Then Ramirez spoke. "You want to know about Sarah Johnson?" Edward nodded. "Yes." Ramirez leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "She was one of the best workers on the docks." Edward listened carefully. "Strong," Ramirez continued. "Always showed up early. Never complained." Martin took notes quietly beside him. Ramirez looked toward the open warehouse doors where the harbor crane stood in the distance. That night, the storm came faster than anyone expected. Edward felt his chest tighten. "What happened?" Ramirez spoke slowly. "Wind started hitting the containers around 10. He paused. "Supervisors got the first warning around 11. Edward remembered the timeline from the report. "Did the workers want to stop?" Ramirez gave a dry laugh. "Of course we did." Edward looked at him, but operations kept going. Ramirez nodded. "Orders from above." Martin and Edward exchanged a quick glance. "Who gave those orders?" Martin asked. Ramirez shrugged. "Site management said the shipping schedule couldn't change." Edward's jaw tightened. "And Sarah?" Ramirez looked down at his hands. When the evacuation finally started, some of the younger guys panicked. Edward leaned forward. "What did she do?" Ramirez looked directly at him now. "She stayed." Edward felt the words hit harder than expected. "She helped 2 of the loaders get their harnesses loose," Ramirez said. "By the time they got clear," he stopped speaking. Edward waited. The crane cable snapped. Ramirez finished quietly. The warehouse felt suddenly colder. Edward spoke carefully. "They never found her." Ramirez shook his head. "No." Silence filled the space between them. Finally, Ramirez looked at Edward again. "You want the truth?" Edward nodded. "The storm didn't kill Sarah Johnson," Ramirez said. Edward's eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" Ramirez leaned back slowly. "The storm only finished what bad decisions started." The words hung in the air like thunder waiting to break. Edward Harrison realized something in that moment. The investigation had never really ended. It had simply stopped asking questions. And now those questions were beginning to return. One worker at a time. One memory at a time. One truth at a time. Somewhere across the city, a little girl named Annie was probably sitting at the kitchen table with her grandmother. She had only wanted to bring flowers to her mother. But without knowing it, she had just started uncovering the story of what truly happened the night the storm came. Martin and Edward left the warehouse in silence. The noise of the harbor swallowed them again the moment they stepped outside. Forklifts beeped as they reversed across the concrete. Cargo cranes swung slowly above the docks, lifting containers onto waiting trucks. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Edward stood still for a moment, staring across the loading yard. Carlos Ramirez's words echoed in his mind. The storm didn't kill Sarah Johnson. The storm only finished what bad decisions started. Martin broke the silence first. "Well," he said quietly, "that was worse than I expected." Edward didn't answer. Martin continued walking slowly toward the parked car, lowering his voice. "If Ramirez is telling the truth, this isn't just a weather accident." Edward followed him. "No, it's negligence." Edward stopped walking. Martin turned back toward him. "You understand what that means, right?" Edward looked out across the harbor again. Workers moved between the container rows like small figures beneath the giant steel cranes. Yes, Edward said. It means people died because someone refused to stop the job. Martin crossed his arms. And if we dig deeper, we might discover exactly who made that call. Edward nodded. That's the point. Martin studied him carefully. You realize something else? Edward raised an eyebrow slightly. What? Martin spoke slowly. The shipping schedule that night, the one Ramirez mentioned? Edward waited. That schedule came from corporate. Edward's expression didn't change, but he already understood. Corporate meant Harrison Development, his company. Martin watched him closely. We need to be careful, Martin said. Edward exhaled slowly. Careful doesn't mean silent. They reached the car. The driver opened the door. But before Edward stepped inside, a voice called out behind them. Mr. Harrison. Both men turned. Carlos Ramirez was jogging across the yard toward them. When he reached them, he lowered his voice. There's something else you should know. Edward waited. Ramirez glanced around to make sure no one was listening. After the storm, management told us not to talk much about what happened that night. Martin frowned. Why? Ramirez gave a tired shrug. They said the investigation would handle everything. Edward looked directly at him. But you think there was more? Ramirez nodded slowly. There was a supervisor on duty that night. Name? Derek Collins. Martin immediately recognized it. Collins ran the night shift. Ramirez nodded. He was the one who told us to keep loading even when the wind started getting bad. Edward felt a slow anger building inside him. Where is he now? Ramirez looked toward the far end of the harbor. Still works here. Edward's eyes narrowed slightly. Doing what? Site operations manager. Martin exhaled quietly. That means he reports directly to corporate. Edward turned toward the driver. Stay here. Then he looked back at Ramirez. Take us to him. Ramirez hesitated. You sure about that? Edward's voice was calm. Yes. They walked deeper into the harbor yard. The cranes towered above them as they moved between stacks of cargo containers. Finally, Ramirez pointed toward a small office building overlooking the docks. That's him. Inside the glass office, a tall man in a white safety helmet stood looking over paperwork spread across a desk. Ramirez stopped walking. That's Derek Collins. Edward studied the man through the window. 3 years ago, Collins had been the supervisor responsible for the loading deck where Sarah Johnson worked. Edward turned to Martin. Ready? Martin sighed quietly. Not even slightly. Edward opened the office door. Collins looked up immediately. Mr. Harrison? He quickly straightened. I didn't know you were visiting today. Edward stepped inside. I wasn't planning to. Collins glanced nervously between Edward and Martin. What can I do for you? Edward walked closer to the desk. I'm reviewing the storm incident from 3 years ago. Collins' expression changed instantly. That investigation was already completed. Edward nodded. Yes, but I'm hearing new information. Collins shifted uncomfortably. From who? Workers who were here that night. Collins leaned back slightly. Storms cause confusion. People remember things differently. Edward studied him carefully. That's possible. The room grew quiet. Then Edward asked the question directly. Did you give the order to continue loading operations after the storm warnings came in? Collins' face tightened. That decision wasn't mine alone. Edward felt something click into place. Whose was it? Collins hesitated. Martin stepped forward. You should answer that carefully. Collins ran a hand across his forehead. Finally, he said quietly, we were under pressure to finish the shipment. Edward waited. Pressure from who? Collins looked at Edward directly now. From headquarters. The room fell silent. Outside the office window, the harbor continued operating like any other day. But inside the room, something far heavier had just surfaced. Martin spoke slowly. Headquarters meaning Harrison Development. Collins nodded once. Edward Harrison stood perfectly still. 3 years ago, he had believed the storm was the cause. Now he understood something far more dangerous. The storm had only been the final moment. The real story had started long before the wind ever reached the harbor. And now the truth was beginning to climb its way back to the surface. One decision at a time. One witness at a time. One storm that refused to stay buried. The office door closed slowly behind Derek Collins. For a moment, none of the 3 men spoke. Outside the glass windows of the harbor office, cranes continued moving cargo containers with mechanical precision. Engines roared, forklifts beeped, and workers shouted across the loading docks. But inside the small office, the air had turned heavy. Edward Harrison stood very still. Headquarters, he repeated quietly. Collins nodded once. clearly uncomfortable now. Yes. Martin stepped forward slightly. You're saying the order to continue loading during the storm came from Harrison Development? Collins raised both hands defensively. I'm saying the pressure came from above. The schedule had already been delayed twice that month. We were told the shipment had to leave. Edward spoke calmly. Who told you that? Collins hesitated. Martin leaned forward. This is the part where you choose honesty. Collins swallowed. Regional operations. Edward's eyes narrowed slightly. Name? 2. Collins exhaled slowly. Thomas Whitaker. Martin turned toward Edward immediately. Whitaker had been the regional director overseeing the harbor construction during its final phase. Edward remembered him clearly. Sharp suit, constantly talking about timelines. A man obsessed with meeting investor expectations. Whitaker pushed the schedule? Edward asked. Collins nodded. He called twice that night. What did he say? Collins rubbed the back of his neck. He said the ships couldn't wait another day. Martin crossed his arms, and when the storm warning came, Collins gave a bitter half-laugh. He told us storms pass. Edward felt something inside him tighten. 3 simple words. Storms pass. Outside the office window, the harbor continued its steady rhythm of work. But inside Edward's mind, a different image had appeared. A loading dock in the middle of the night. Wind rising. Workers trying to finish a shipment while waves crashed against the pier. And somewhere among them, Sarah Johnson. Edward spoke again. When did you finally order the evacuation? Collins looked down at the floor. Too late. The words were quiet but unmistakable. Martin wrote something in his notebook. How late? The wind was already knocking containers loose, Collins said. We should have stopped an hour earlier. Edward said nothing. Collins continued slowly. Sarah was helping 2 younger guys unhook a cargo net when the crane cable snapped. Edward closed his eyes briefly. And the water? Came over the dock about 30 seconds later. The room fell silent. Martin broke it carefully. Did Whitaker ever ask what happened after the storm? Collins gave a short shake of his head. No. What do you mean? He called the next morning asking if the shipment was lost. Edward looked at him. Not the workers? Collins didn't answer. The silence said enough. Martin finally closed his notebook. All right. He turned to Edward. We should go. Edward didn't move right away. He studied Collins for another moment. Why didn't you say any of this 3 years ago? Collins met his gaze. Because the investigation didn't ask. Edward understood exactly what that meant. Investigations sometimes look for truth, but sometimes they only look for closure. Edward turned toward the door. Martin followed him outside. The harbor air felt colder now. For several seconds, neither man spoke as they walked toward the car. Finally, Martin said quietly, Well, Edward waited. That just changed everything. Edward looked back toward the office building where Collins still stood inside the window. Yes, he said. It did. Martin opened the car door but paused before getting inside. You know what this means legally? Edward nodded. It means the storm report was incomplete. Martin shook his head. It means your company may have pushed workers into a dangerous situation. Edward didn't respond, because that possibility had already settled heavily in his mind. They both climbed into the car. The sedan pulled slowly away from the docks. For several minutes, they drove in silence. Then Martin spoke again. What are you thinking? Edward looked out the window at the cranes slowly fading behind them. I'm thinking about a little girl. Martin raised an eyebrow. Annie. Martin nodded slowly. She just wanted to bring flowers to her mother. Edward leaned back in the seat. Yes. Martin watched him carefully. And now? Edward spoke quietly. Now I want to know exactly why her mother never came home. The car turned onto the highway leading back toward the city. Behind them, the harbor continued operating like any ordinary day. But the truth about that storm had begun to surface piece by piece, and there was still one man who had not been asked the most important questions. Thomas Whitaker, the man who had said the words that kept the dock working through the storm. Storms pass. Edward Harrison looked out across the city skyline as it rose in the distance. Some storms passed, but some storms waited years before revealing the damage they had truly caused. And this one was only just beginning. The meeting with Thomas Whitaker happened 2 days later. Edward insisted it take place in person, not over the phone, not through lawyers, face to face. Whitaker arrived at the top-floor conference room of Harrison Development just after noon. He looked exactly the same as Edward remembered: sharp navy suit, silver tie, the confident posture of a man who had spent his career delivering results on time. But when he walked into the room and saw Edward and Martin waiting, Something in his expression shifted. "Edward," Whitaker said with a polite nod. Edward didn't return the smile. "Sit down, Thomas." Whitaker took the chair across the table. "I understand you've been asking questions about Riverside Harbor." Edward folded his hands calmly. "That's right." Whitaker glanced briefly at Martin. "I thought the investigation was settled years ago." Martin leaned back slightly. "It was closed." Whitaker gave a satisfied nod. "Exactly." Edward slid a printed document across the table. Whitaker looked down. The email was highlighted. "Storm conditions worsening. Recommend stopping loading operations." Below it, the reply. "Storms pass. Continue operations." Whitaker's face tightened slightly. Edward spoke quietly. "Did you write that?" Whitaker leaned back in the chair. "That was 3 years ago." "Yes. And the harbor opened successfully afterward." Edward didn't move. "That wasn't my question." Whitaker looked at him carefully. "Yes," he said finally. "I wrote it." The room fell silent. Martin watched closely. Edward continued. "You were informed the wind speeds were rising." Whitaker nodded. "Yes. And you still ordered operations to continue." Whitaker shrugged slightly. "We were behind schedule." Edward stared at him. "So you kept workers on the dock." Whitaker leaned forward now, his tone sharpening. "That's how business works, Edward. Deadlines matter." Edward's voice remained calm. "People matter more." Whitaker laughed softly. "Come on. You know better than that." Edward didn't respond. Whitaker continued. "The storm wasn't supposed to hit that hard, but it did." Whitaker's expression hardened. "And accidents happen." Edward slowly slid another document across the table. A witness statement from Carlos Ramirez. Whitaker read it quickly. "Dock workers always tell dramatic stories," he said dismissively. Edward leaned forward slightly. "One of those workers was Sarah Johnson." Whitaker paused. Edward continued. "She stayed behind helping 2 others escape." Whitaker said nothing. "She never made it off the dock." Whitaker folded the document and pushed it back across the table. "And what exactly do you want from me?" Edward looked at him for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "The truth." Whitaker scoffed. "The truth is that Harbor generates hundreds of millions in revenue every year." Edward didn't blink. "And Sarah Johnson?" Whitaker's jaw tightened. "She was one worker in a large operation." The room went still. Martin slowly set his pen down. Edward stood up. Whitaker frowned slightly. "Where are you going?" Edward walked to the large window overlooking the Chicago River. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he spoke without turning around. 3 nights ago, a little girl asked me to take her to see her mother." Whitaker didn't respond. Edward continued. "She brought flowers." Still silence. "She thought the harbor might remember her." Edward turned back toward the table. Whitaker looked confused. "What does that have to do with—" "That girl," Edward said quietly, "was Sarah Johnson's daughter." Whitaker's expression shifted slightly, but only slightly. Edward walked back toward the table. "She's 6 years old now." Whitaker said nothing. "She believes her mother is part of the harbor." Edward stopped beside the chair. "And in a way, she's right." The room was silent again. Martin watched carefully. Edward placed both hands on the table. "Thomas Whitaker," he said calmly, "your decision kept workers on that dock when they should have been evacuated." Whitaker's face hardened. "You can't prove that." Edward slid one final document forward, a printed copy of the internal call log from that night. Whitaker's number appeared twice. Timestamps matching the storm escalation. Whitaker stared at it. Martin spoke quietly. "We can." Whitaker leaned back slowly. For the first time since entering the room, his confidence faded. "What happens now?" he asked. Edward answered without hesitation. "You resign." Whitaker looked stunned. "And if I don't?" Edward's voice remained steady. "Then the full investigation becomes public." Whitaker looked between Edward and Martin. He understood. Corporate negligence. Wrongful death. Public scandal. He stood up slowly. "You're making a mistake." Edward shook his head. "No. No." Whitaker picked up his briefcase. "This will cost the company." Edward replied calmly. "Some things should." Whitaker walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned back. "All of this, for one worker?" Edward answered quietly. "For the truth." Whitaker left. The door closed behind him. For a moment, the room was completely silent. Martin exhaled slowly. "Well," he said. Edward looked out the window again. "What?" "That's going to make the news." Edward nodded. "Yes." Martin studied him. "You're okay with that?" Edward thought about the harbor. The broken crane. The flowers Annie had left beside the railing. Yes, he said. A week later, a small memorial plaque appeared near the end of the Riverside Harbor Pier. It listed 3 names. Among them, Sarah Johnson. Annie returned with her grandmother that spring afternoon. Edward stood a short distance away while the girl placed fresh flowers beneath the plaque. She looked up at him afterward. Edward? Yes. Mom's name is here now. He nodded. Yes. Annie smiled. Grandma says that means people will remember her. Edward looked across the harbor. The cranes moved slowly above the docks. Ships entered the channel, just as they always had. Yes, he said quietly. They will. Annie slipped her small hand into his. The lake wind moved gently across the water, and somewhere within the endless motion of the harbor, the story of one storm and one woman who never left the dock would finally be remembered. The story reminds us that progress and success should never come at the cost of human lives. Behind every large project, every business decision, and every deadline, there are real people with families, hopes, and loved ones waiting for them to come home. Annie's quiet courage and love for her mother awaken Edward's conscience and reveal an important truth. True leadership is not measured by profit or achievement, but by responsibility and compassion. The story teaches that justice may take time, but when someone chooses to face the truth, even a small act like a child bringing flowers can bring dignity to those who were forgotten and remind society that every life matters. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.